Hello again and welcome. My name is Sherry Marks. I'm the pastor of the Church of the Open Door in Ukiah, California, and we're delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for coming, joining us. Before we get into the real purpose of this message, let me just remind you, if you've been here before, or let you know if this is your first time joining us, that we do have a brief communion service after the message, and everyone is welcome to partake in it. And so if you would like to go out, maybe put us on pause a moment if you need to, go get a piece of bread, a cracker, a cookie, something that you can have to eat when we get to that point, and something to drink. It doesn't have to be what this is. And just have it handy so that when we arrive there, you'll have it and we'll be able to all join in together. Just remember to come back and turn this back on again. Please join me in a brief prayer just to bring ourselves all together, to center ourselves here as one. Holy One, we thank you for calling us together to this time, this place. Regardless of the time wherever we may be, regardless of the place, at this moment, in this time, we are all together as one, joined in answer to God's call. Please open our ears, open our hearts to hear your word, that we may understand what you are saying to us here. Let us be one. Thank you for calling us here together. Amen. I'm going to begin today with two rather longish readings. The first one comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, and it's the first 14 verses. The parable of the wedding banquet. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged and sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' The slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to his attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him out into the outer darkness, where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The second reading comes from Luke's Gospel, the 14th chapter, verses 16 through 24, the parable of the great dinner. Jesus said, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I am going to try them out. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have just been married and therefore I cannot come.' So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, 'Go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' And the slave said, 'Sir, what you ordered has been done, and there is still room.' Then the master said to the slave, 'Go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'" So here we have 2 versions of what is clearly one story. In the first, from the writer of Matthew's Gospel, we find Jesus in Jerusalem teaching in the temple grounds. The temple was a sprawling site with the Holy of Holies in the center, and was surrounded by several different courts, complete with balconies where rabbis and other visiting teachers could stand and teach their followers. Jesus would most likely have been in the court of the women, where both men and women would have been able to hear him. It was from one such setting that Jesus shared the parable of the wedding banquet, our first reading. Just as a brief refresher on Matthew's Gospel, which we've been covering off and on all this past year, this would have been written at its earliest somewhere in the last 10 to 15 years of the 1st century, making it extremely unlikely that this is the Matthew who was one of the original 12 who traveled with Jesus. Since we don't really know much of this writer, who was only called Matthew by later writers, there's no point in even bothering to discuss him much. The second version of this story was recorded by a writer who remained unnamed until 2nd century Christians decided to identify him with the Luke who was a traveling companion of Paul. He never identifies himself as such in either Luke or Acts, so as with the writer of Matthew, we just don't know much about him. Some scholars lean to the possibility that Luke may even have been written by a woman. We don't know. But modern scholarship does lean towards dating it somewhere in the 1st or the 2nd decade of the 2nd century, making it somewhere between 10 to 30 years after the writings of Matthew. There is no king and no wedding in the 2nd version, only a rich man who decides to throw a big party in this, the parable of the great dinner. Aside from the big party meal and the rejection of the initially invited, one more thing the 2 versions have in common is the anger expressed by both the king and the rich man. Each had thrown a major feast, and each had been humiliated by the refusals of those invited. But Matthew's version certainly has more reason for this over-the-top reaction to the murder of his servants, even though it seems a particularly bloody response and nowhere admirable to our modern eyes. But the whole bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth appears to be way out of proportion at least it appears to us that way, for the apparent crime of not wearing a wedding garment. It's nowhere as bloody as destroying a city, but far from a good look nonetheless. In contrast, the worst that we can find here in Luke's version is sending his servants out to compel people on the street to come in and fill up the guest quota. Now, as far as I'm aware, compel means to force someone to do something. So to go in off the street and just haul in people who had not been invited, may have had no idea this was even going on, may have been busy with other things, but in they go to fill up the guest list. It's tacky, but it's not too violent, at least not as compared to Matthew. Excuse me a moment. Now, if, as it has always been taught down through the centuries, the king and the rich man both represent God, the beaten and slaughtered servants are the prophets sent by God to warn the Hebrews, but often rejected and even killed by those who would not listen. The rude invitees represent the Hebrew peoples who were the first choice to be invited, but who ignored God's invitations for them to join into this party in the midst of God's kingdom. Neither Matthew nor Luke give us an admirable picture of the king / rich man / God. At least not admirable by our standards today. Perhaps it was perfectly normal in their day. It would be stretching credulity too far to say that these are two separate stories. There are too many obvious similarities to go there. I think it's safe to say that this is the same story, but remembered and told by two widely separated communities. Separated first by geography and then by years. And finally by the communities for which they were written. Matthew's version was written for Jewish hearers, making sure they understand their failure and their responsibility for the rage of the king. Luke's version would likely have been written for diaspora Jews or for Gentile Christian converts, where Matthew's anger might have turned future believers away. Luke's was at least much gentler. Again, this parable, in whichever version, requires that we pay close attention to the reading and recognize that the authors, while telling essentially the same story, are each expressing their own views and tailoring their versions to fit their presumed audiences, and therefore end up telling a story that has its main points the same, but otherwise is so very different in so many ways. Which is closest to the version Jesus might have told? Who knows? But we need to pay attention to both. We need to be aware of their differences, and we need to be aware of their similarities. We need to read carefully, and we need to listen. It makes us wonder, at least I hope it makes us wonder, because we should wonder, how many of the stories in Scripture that are Jesus stories, that are told in different places, which ones are the ones closest to what Jesus would have ever said? This is one example. We have the story told to us in all four Gospels, but in such different ways. Some of the Gospels require only about 2 small paragraphs to tell us the whole story of the Last Supper. John's Gospel goes on for chapter after chapter after chapter, telling us all the things that happened there. Such different stories, such different ways of expressing an experience. Experienced one way by one group of people, experienced another by another group. And if each of us were to tell our stories of our experience of coming to this table, they would all be different also. And yet it's the same story. It's the same bread, it's the same cup, it's the same Jesus. So we know our own stories. Do we? How often have we listened to other people's stories? There was a time, 2,000 or so years ago, when Jesus gathered with his friends, and at that gathering, he took a piece of bread and he offered it up, he prayed over it, and he said to the others there, "This is my body. This bread will be given to you, and as the bread is broken, so will I be broken." This is God's promise, and this is my promise. And there's a reason for this. And when he took the last of the cups that were part of what went around the table there, he lifted it up and he blessed it, and he said, "This cup is my blood, my life poured out and given for you." And there's a reason for this. God had promised never ever to leave us, never to abandon us, never to discard us in his anger, if there were anger. So it was God's new covenant, and Jesus himself was the seal on that covenant, the offering made to seal and bind that covenant, that new promise. And so when we break the bread, we are indeed reminding ourselves of that promise when Jesus told us he would be broken for us. And when the cup was poured out and the fruit was given for all to drink, it was Jesus' life given for us as the binding of that promise. And so we each have our own story of this table, of this bread and this cup. But in each story, Jesus is the seal. Jesus is the promise. And we know that we can count on it forever. So take your bread or whatever you've brought to the table and eat. Take the cup with whatever you've brought as drink and drink. And we each in our own way, in our own versions, seal ourselves into this new covenant. We accept it and we agree to it and we gather to be part of it. Every time we eat the bread, every time we drink from the cup. Every time. Thank you for joining us today, from wherever you are, whenever you are. Thank you for joining yourselves together in this promise with us. So go now into the week ahead of you. Go out to love and serve God, and may you be blessed. Thank you.
Welcome and hope with the Church of the Open Door. You are welcome here. We invite you in to share the bread, to share